This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Do you have a point of sale system you can trust, or is it a real POS? You need Shopify for retail. From accepting payments to managing inventory, Shopify POS has everything you need to sell in person. Go to shopify.com/system, all lowercase, to take your retail business to the next level today. That's shopify.com/system.
The Columbia River was once home to an estimated 16 million salmon. They were the life force that sustained indigenous people throughout the Pacific Northwest for thousands of years, but then white settlers came to the region in the 19th century, and between the effects of overfishing and climate change, there's only a fraction of those historic populations of fish left today. Today on CityCast Portland, we're talking with OPB Investigations editor Tony Schick about his new 6-part podcast, Salmon Wars. We'll dig deep into the history of the fish, the radical efforts to preserve them, and the threats that they still face today. It's Thursday, May 16th. I'm John Notarianni, in for Claudia Meza, and this is what Portland's talking about. So we've known each other for a couple years. We used to work together at OPB, and you're kind of a hotshot investigative reporter, you know?
Yes. Well, I introduced myself as Tony Schick, hotshot investigative reporter. I tried to get OPB to put that on my business cards, but they declined. Like a hotshot, I had to print up my own. So.
But like with the Salmon Wars project, in the podcast, you talk about how you grew up in Oregon, and a lot of this history you didn't know, right? Like a lot of the nuances of these stories were things that you've discovered through your reporting. And I wonder, like, what was it like learning about all of this history over the past decade of reporting?
Yeah, I knew like really vague pieces of this history. I knew that there were, the fish wars. I knew some of the salmon conflicts over the years. I just did not know, so many of the details of the way the treaties happened. The governor of the territories at the time says to his interpreter, tell the tribes if they don't sign, they'll walk knee deep in blood. Mm-hmm. But I kind of grew up hearing, the treaties here were largely peaceful.
Yeah.
And in some sense they were, but there was also that threat of violence, and obviously war broke out, afterwards as well.
Yeah. So 17-year-old Tony had a much rosier view of this.
17-year-old Tony was worried about who the Blazers were going to draft, which is not that much different than...
Which I was going to say, that sounds like Tony today as well.
It does, yes. But I'm at least able to put that into a little bit better perspective.
Yeah. Well, I think after listening to your series, it's hard to imagine just how important salmon were to the indigenous people of the Pacific Northwest once upon a time. So, I wonder if you could paint me a picture. Let's go back to, the banks of the Columbia 300 years ago. What was the relationship of the people who lived here to these fish?
It was crucial. It's something that is considered sacred, used in ceremonies. In one of our episodes, someone describes it as a sacrament. At the same time, it was also the staple of their diet, and it was also currency. Celilo Falls was... People describe it as like the original Wall Street of the West, where people would come and trade.
Yeah.
So you would have seen people on scaffolds, building scaffolds over the falls. Mm-hmm. You would have seen people with large dip nets, different kinds of nets. You would have seen people, bartering beside the river, playing stick game, different kind of gambling games in which that was a form of trading and bartering. You would have seen people processing the salmon, like cutting it, drying it, things like that. And some of that still exists today, where it becomes a whole family affair of fishing and then other people involved in taking care of the salmon.
Yeah, you tell a lot of this story through the family of Randy Settler, who's a Yakima tribal fisherman today. And I think it was Randy who sort of pointed out that just the bodies of the salmon, there used to be so many of them that the nutrients from their bodies basically nourished the animals and the trees and every living thing here.
Yeah, totally. You can look at studies where they've examined the soil in the Northwest and found nutrients and such in the soil that only could have gotten there from the ocean. The only way they could have gotten there was from something like the salmon, some sort of ocean-going species that bring them back. And so they're really a crucial piece of the Northwest in ways that we think about and ways that we don't.
Yeah, yeah. But, then in the 1800s, white settlers begin showing up in the Northwest, and that's sort of when we get to this era of treaties. For people who just don't know that history, who went through a public school system and just never got that knowledge, like what should we all know about the battles over these treaties that sort of paved the way for the way that the region's set up today?
Yeah, so some of the treaties were kind of the result of conflicts. Some of them predated conflicts and were an attempt to avoid bloody wars. By the time that people were signing treaties in the Northwest, a lot of war and extermination of Native people had happened in other parts of the country, and there was a desire to avoid that. At the same time, the United States was trying to coerce tribes into giving up their land, and tribes made kind of a strategic decision to we're going to preserve what we can of our ways of life and our resources and our sacred areas while trying to avoid a war over these areas.
What were the outcomes of all of those negotiations?
One of the things that is often kind of that maybe I had an incorrect assumption of, and a lot of people I think do, is the idea that there's some sort of special right granted to tribes in the treaties in exchange for the land. But that's not what it is. It's the tribes already had this right before any white settlers arrived, and they preserved that right of their own and granted the right to white settlers to share in it. In terms of the river, they retained the right to access fish in all of their usual places. That's one thing to have that right secured on paper, but then it needs to be honored, and it wasn't.
Yeah. So you're talking with Randy throughout this podcast. What sorts of conversations did you have with Randy and his community about that history?
Yeah, I mean, Randy's very matter of fact about it. It's not spoken of in a bitter way or anything. He just is matter of fact about what happened to the salmon and what happened to people in his family.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things that I found really interesting in this series that I didn't know about at all is some of this more radical rebellion stuff that happened. The activism, especially in the 60s, of the tribal rights movements that were happening. And fish-ins and some of that real direct civil disobedience around U.S. policy. Can you tell me a little bit about that? Because that was just so wild.
Yeah, I mean, that was something where we're in the car one day talking to Randy about fishing and policy, and I asked him why he does what he does, and he talked about his mom and dad getting jailed for fishing. Their fishing was heavily restricted by the states over time. And they asserted their rights the only way that they knew how, by fishing. And he said that they took notice of the sit-ins of the civil rights movement and how people were asserting their rights through that.
And they were actually doing sit-ins, right?
Yes, they would call them fish-ins, and basically what they would do is they would show up with a large enough group of people and they would fish in an area at a time when the state laws and regulations said they weren't supposed to be fishing. And, from their perspective, this is a place where we've fished since, they say, time immemorial.
Yeah.
And now you're going to come in and deplete the fish and then tell us that we can't fish here.
Yeah.
That's what they were protesting. And they would wait to get arrested. And then they would fight those arrests in court.
You also had this story of this woman who was basically a black market underground fish dealer.
Yeah, that's Randy's mom.
Yeah.
Yeah, so she kind of lived her life as a form of protest in many ways. So people would fish against these regulations, but then they also had to make a living off of their fish. And so she became a fish dealer and a buyer, and she would buy fish from Native people all up and down the river, and had a whole operation at their house of people cutting and cleaning and packaging the fish. But then you have to find someone to sell all those fish to, and they're not strictly legal. So it meant selling to people who were willing to buy that, and they were. And
can we say fish gangsters?
Well, I wouldn't call Mary Settler a fish gangster, but I think perhaps the people she sold to.
Yeah.
The way that her niece put it that we interviewed was that the people she sold to If she ever thought about telling on them in court, she'd have been rubbed out on the way to the courthouse. So,
And like, I just think it is still worth underlining that, like, this is to do something that her people and her ancestors have, like, been doing for thousands of years.
yes. She knew that she was breaking the law, and she was doing it because it was the only way she felt her people could survive. And the intention was not to be a scofflaw. The intention was to do something that their people had always done.
Yeah.
But they were getting jailed for it.
Yeah, well, I want to get into the next chapter of this story, but first, let's take a quick break.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Do you have a point of sale system you can trust, or is it a real POS? You need Shopify for retail. From accepting payments to managing inventory, Shopify POS has everything you need to sell in person. Go to shopify.com/system, all lowercase, to take your retail business to the next level today. That's shopify.com/system.
When do these concerns about the preservation of the fish start to get wrapped up in climate change? And how does that sort of change the whole conversation here?
Yeah. So kind of right around the time that tribes are winning a lot of court battles to regain their fishing rights and to kind of manage the river and co-manage the salmon, that is all happening right around the time when fish are kind of hitting the endangered species list. And there's growing concern about extinction. There are kind of hints at climate change in some reports from like the 1990s, 1996.
Okay, yeah.
But that concern has really escalated in recent years because there were some good ocean years in like the early 2010s, I want to say, but things started to tick upward, and then the bottom fell out of that, basically.
Yeah.
And 2018-ish, we get some of the worst years for salmon survival on record. And then 2020, I believe it's 2020, maybe 2021, there's a study from NOAA estimating what survival for salmon is going to look like in the next 40 years. And any way they sliced that data, it was pretty dire.
Can you give us some numbers, like what was the population like historically, and what are we at today?
Yeah, it fluctuates, but a lot of estimates are over 10 million fish. 16 million fish is kind of a one that's often used.
This is historically, like way back before.
Yeah, yes. This would be like pre-1800s, basically. And now we are in the 1 to 2 million range.
So yeah, that's like 90% plus depletion. And it's so ironic because now the US government is like all on board with preservation, right? But there's so many things that have been put in place that make it really difficult to sort of achieve those goals, right? I mean, like, I think about how you point out the Bonneville Power Administration in your series. Tell us a little bit about like what they do, why they're important, and like why that's just like a sticky issue when it comes to protecting these fish.
Yeah, I mean, we built so much of the modern Northwest on the backs of salmon that it's going to be hard to restore salmon without making some sacrifices.
Mm-hmm.
And one of those is cheap power. We have pretty cheap power in the Northwest, and a lot of that comes from hydropower, damming the rivers and being able to use the rivers to generate electricity. Bonneville Power Administration is the federal agency that markets the power from those dams, and they are a really big entity in the Northwest now. And those dams make a lot of money. They're not for profit being a federal agency, but they bring in a lot of money, and they pay off debts for things like the original construction of the dams,
Mm-hmm.
and they also pay for fish restoration, millions and millions of dollars every year.
So they're on both sides of it.
Yeah. I don't think there's an agency that is kind of like more in the center of salmon on the Columbia than BPA, because some of the things that harm salmon the most, like Grand Coulee Dam, that is blocking hundreds of miles of habitat, just wiped out some runs entirely.
Mm-hmm.
That's the dam that makes the most electricity for BPA to sell.
Yeah.
At the same time, most of the recovery efforts are funded with money from those sales.
Yeah. Well, Are there any restoration efforts that seem like they're working right now? Like, do we have a plan to protect these fish?
There's some things that are more effective than others. One of the things we mentioned in the podcast is that a lot of the habitat restoration work that's been done to date is not something we can point to and say that it's effective. It's been low-hanging fruit kind of things and kind of quick fix, compared to the lifespan of a river quick fix. Tribes have had quite a bit of success in boosting populations, at least with using hatcheries that they have designed kind of as wild fish nurseries, where they will raise fish in the hatcheries, but try their best to mimic the wild and keep the fish as wild as they can in terms of their behavior and genetics. Some of the biggest stories of fish rebounding in the Columbia Basin are because of those tribal hatchery efforts, which have been paired with habitat restoration as well.
Yeah. It's just perfect that like some of the most successful efforts are coming from the tribes themselves, right?
Right. And there are layers to this because the efforts are coming from the tribes who are using a tool of hatcheries, but hatcheries were a tool that were originally made to mass produce fish for ocean fishing and lower river fishing that contributed heavily to the depletion of the stocks that tribes relied on upriver and have also been detrimental to the genetics of wild fish because they get a little domesticated. And that's something that as the tribes have taken over hatcheries and tried to make them better for wild fish, they face criticisms of you're domesticating the fish still. And they would argue, you're expecting salmon to do too much. We're trying to help the salmon, and we're raising fish that, maybe they were born in a hatchery, but they're still able to swim out to the ocean past all these things trying to kill them.
Yeah. It's interesting. At a certain point in the series, you kind of ask Randy, like, your family has been fighting for this for generations. There's been all these challenges. There's been court battles. There's been, people have gone to jail. Like, why are you still so focused on fishing? And his response is basically like, well, of course. Like, there isn't a question of whether or not to do it.
No. And he even said, before me, there was another Yakima tribal member fighting for this stuff. And before them, there was another. And after me, there will be another. And he got a little frustrated with me at one point when I implied that the fight was only about them exercising their treaty rights. And he was like, this is not about just us fishing. This is about all living things in the Northwest.
Yeah. But I mean, I think, if there is a sort of bright spot to end on in any of this, it is sort of just like that for Randy, for the Yakima people, it's like, we're just going to keep protecting these fish because we've always done it and we're always going to.
Yeah, they're not going to stop.
Yeah.
No matter what it takes. Yeah.
Well, Tony, this is an incredible project. I really loved listening to it.
Thank you so much.
I think people should check it out. So thanks for all your work on this.
I hope they do. Thank you. Appreciate it.
And now for some events happening this week. Every Thursday on the show, we like to bring you some recommendations to help you plan your weekend. Here's what we got today. This Friday and Saturday, the 24th annual McMenamin's UFO Festival is touching down at Hotel Oregon in McMinnville. There will be live music, parades, costume balls, and contests. All Earthlings are welcome. Closer to home, both literally and figuratively, the summer's first Sunday Parkways event is happening in East Portland this weekend on Sunday from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. A car-free route will be open for walking, rolling, scooting, and biking from Gateway Discovery Park to Lincoln Park. And finally, the 9th annual Vanport Mosaic Festival is getting underway this weekend at various venues across the city. It's an annual remembrance and celebration of the multiracial community that existed in the 1940s here, a time when racial segregation was the norm in Portland. This Sunday morning, you can explore revolutionary activism in Northeast Portland on a walking tour with Kent Ford, co-founder of the Portland chapter of the Black Panther Party. And be sure to keep an eye out for all the festival's events through the end of the month. For even more local news and events, sign up for our daily newsletter, Hey Portland. We'll toss a link in the show notes. Well, that's all for us today here on CityCast Portland, but thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell a friend or leave us a rating or a review? Claudia will be back tomorrow with more from around the city. But until then, see you at Slim's.